Thank you, Father, for the invitation, for all of you guys for being here. Just a short introduction. I was raised Catholic, became an atheist for more than 15 years. All my career has been with evolution. So the talk is whether you guys should be evolutionists or not. I think my position is going to become very clear early on. But one question that you may ask, and I think is a fair question, is why should I care about this topic? Isn't evolution just scientific theory? Why making a fuss out of it? Well, when I talk to people, I usually get two reactions on evolution. Either they're extreme and keeping it from one end or the other. They can be like, well, evolution is a biological fact, nothing to discuss. Or they can be, well, evolution is idiotic. I don't know how can someone believe on that. But the vast majority of people are indifferent. They just say, well, it doesn't quite matter if evolution is true or not. It's, by definition, if it's true, it's not going to affect my faith. The truth cannot contradict another truth, etc. I think all these positions are very dangerous because some of them will disregard a few nuances that have to be taken into account. Others are a bit, ignoring the risks. So rather than talking about evolution straight away in terms of defining it and showing the evidence we have for it, I want to also show the importance of talking about this subject. And you don't have to go as far as the Bible and St. Thomas of Aquinas to understand the issue here. And what St. Paul and Aquinas are saying here is that God is the source of all goodness, is the source of all being. So you can know God, the effects of God through nature. So if you understand nature wrongly, if you attribute nature to different causes, you're going to understand God wrongly, or you even can become an atheist. So it's not something to disregard, understanding creation. And perhaps some of you do not remember or not told, but evolution has been used in modern times to justify racism. So, for example, the early evolutionists would even place blacks and whites as having different common ancestors. The whites would have evolved from a higher ape, where the blacks were, evolved from an orangutan. So this thing has been, and it was not just one guy, it was plenty. That's very easy to find in the literature. Darwin himself said, in the Descent of Man, that the savage of this world would be substituted by white eventually. Very few people know. I didn't know this until recently, but they had human zoos exposing, blacks with monkeys as their most common ancestor. So this pygmy is very famous. He was sort of kidnapped and put in a zoo in New York, and he was in exhibition. Look at this pygmy. He's more closely related to the monkey than he is to us. And the Americans would go there to take pictures of him. That's one of the effects of evolution. Ethnic cleansing. The Herero tribes and others in Africa were ethnically cleansed by the Germans in the 20th century. Some call this the first genocide. And it was based on Darwinian ideology. They were wiped for the sole reason of being savages. Okay? So it's an important topic. Eugenics. It was coined by half-cousin of Darwin, Francis Galton. So this country had an eugenic society. The U.S. had one. Have to get rid of those folks, have some disease. That's social Darwinism. Well, but that's a few years ago. We don't have that stuff anymore. Well, we kind of do. Abortion is eugenics. Iceland pretty much eradicated Down syndrome by selective abortion. That's Darwinism. The fittest must survive. The weak have to be wiped out. Why not give nature a little bit of a hand? And if that's not scary enough, well, they're coming for your kids as well, because, in schools, they teach evolution as a dogma, right? So these papers here, I read them, they're very scary. They're fascinating, but they're scary, because what they are figuring out is that kids, even at the age of 4, they naturally can understand purpose in nature. They look at a part of an animal or a plant and they see that it works for the sake of the whole. They have a teleological thinking. That's why, because they have an immortal soul, they have an intellect, reality comes through them, and they accept reality for what it is. So these papers are pretty much discussing how to rewire the kids' brains so that they can accept evolution, because they automatically do not see it. That's very scary, particularly for you who have kids. That would be taught in any school you go. And the clergy, evolution is taught as dogma. So it's a huge discussion. I've read hundreds of papers. I've been to talks among Dominicans, among priests, theologians, philosophers. They take evolution as a fact, and they try to conform Catholicism to it. And I don't have to tell you that a lot of nonsense, to avoid the word that starts with H, comes out of these talks. I've heard, for example, that Eve was born from the side of Adam. That meant that she was the twin, and they were born inside an ape, so she kind of came from the side. She was a twin. Or maybe Adam was just the chief of a big tribe of pre-humans, and the sin of Adam was just something that he committed and he spread out, even though it was a population, not a human being. It was spread because he was the leader. These things are being told in YouTube. It's everywhere. So it's a problem. It's something that has to be discussed and not just ignored. Well, it's stupid. I don't care. Whatever. Right? So having said this, what on earth then is evolution? Well, this question seems quite simple because everyone seems to think that they know what evolution is, and every time I talk to them I realize they actually don't know, particularly the ones who defend it. So the most common definition, the most accepted definition of evolution comes from Darwin, descent with modification, and today we say that this modification and descent is changes in allele frequencies within population over time. I know, it's a mouthful. What does that even mean? Well, it's quite simple if you think about it. Imagine a population of rabbits. You have two phenotypes, white and brown. You probably remember that from high school. We have, for example, in mammals, in human beings, for example, we have 46 chromosomes. They come in pairs, so you're going to have the same gene in two chromosomes, and the genes are represented by the letters. So you can have a gene that has a variant that is big A or small a. That's what we call dominant, and the recessive allele of the gene. So if you have two recessive alleles, the rabbit has the white color. If it has just one dominant version of the gene, it expresses the brown color. So here, the frequency of the alleles, which is big A and small a, is 50%. They're evenly spread. For whatever cause, it doesn't matter which cause it is. It could be, some of them died, got a disease for whatever reason. If a percentage of the population that dies have more small allele A or big allele A, that will be a change in allele frequency. And for the modern definition of evolution, that will be sufficient to say that's an evolutionary change. It doesn't matter the cause here. So quite simple, isn't it? I think anyone could accept that pretty happily. But you can imagine that's a bit of a problematic definition. And the reason is because it's so broad that it can mean pretty much any genetic change over time in populations. So, for example, if you have a population of beetles, they have different colors, they're coded by different alleles of the gene, and I'm very, very late to work, and I don't look down, and I step on those guys, and I accidentally wipe half of the green beetles. Now you have a change in allele frequency. There's no causal relation between being smashed and being green. It's just, they were there, and I stepped on them. But according to evolutionary definition, this would be an evolutionary change. And it even has a name, it's called genetic drift, the random fluctuation of allele frequencies over time. Pure chance, and that would be evolution. I mean, if that's evolution, I think everyone here is an evolutionist. I've stepped on beetles before. So if you say, well, that's what causes beetles to come into being, I don't think that's the case. So you see the problem here. And the problem is that the word evolution is used equivocally. It can mean a lot of things. So when someone asks you, so are you an evolutionist? They're not thinking in genetic drift. What they're thinking is this, that all life on Earth descend from a common ancestor 3.8 billion years ago, and through natural causes it evolved and led to all this biodiversity. That's what they mean. But see that this is not the definition. So how do they go from, changing allele frequencies to this? Well, that's kind of a scheme here. And what's going on with this kind of conversation is that the causes, the effects, the definitions are getting all packed together and confounded, and depending on who you ask, they're going to think different things. So the idea here is that you have, for example, drift, as I've just explained, natural selection that you probably heard about, and random mutations, which are the apparent causes of evolution, which then leads to changes in allele frequencies over time. If those populations of, let's say, beetles, whatever they are, they get separated and they're changing separately, the evolutionists will say that if they remain separate for a long time and the changes accumulate, you're going to have speciation. Those beetles are going to become so different that you're going to call them different things. So that's what we call new Darwinism, this kind of framework within the circle, or modern synthesis, depending on who you ask. But see that there's nothing about common descent and origin of life or anything on this. But indirectly there is, because it's an axiom, and you're going to realize it informs all evolutionary theory, and it's a faith belief in abiogenesis, that in the beginning of time there was some under a rock life just popped into existence from inanimate matter, and that from that life everything else through these mechanisms came into being. And that's a naturalistic presupposition, because God will not be allowed in any sort of explanation. And I say it's an assumption, and it's a hidden assumption, and I can give you an example. See this news. Animals evolved the ability to gallop 472 million years ago. What is even that? Like, literally, the word evolved here is a buzzword. I could literally take away the evolutionary narrative from this news and say animals galloped 472 million years ago. The hidden assumption here is that, well, the first time I see an animal galloping, and it seems that, everything else descended from that, so if the evolution made these things gallop, and everyone else inherited the galloping. But this is not, it's never proved. If you read this study, they're just describing, let's say, a fossil that shows that a gallop, or like footprints, and it's showing that the animal could gallop, and the evolutionary assumption comes in because it's already an axiom. Okay? So it's a kind of a faith belief. All right. So let's talk about the causes of evolution. Apparent causes, because even that they got wrong, in my opinion. But anyway. So natural selection, you heard about that one. That's the most famous one. Some would actually confound and say that natural selection is evolution, right? So the idea is very simple. You have a population here of deer. They differ in the thickness of their fur. Part of that population migrates to a colder region. The animals with a thicker fur are more adapted than the others because they can survive more the cold. The others die out, or they don't reproduce as much. So the guys who have thicker fur are surviving more, they're reproducing more, and then because they're reproducing more, and their kids are inheriting that variation, then they're going to increase in number, and you're going to have a change in allele frequency. You see the point? But what is the big deal here? What is the wrong conclusion that is coming out of this narrative? Is that if you think about it, natural selection is not a cause at all. The variation was already present. Natural selection is just a name we give to differential reproduction. But what is causing these animals to reproduce differentially? Is the fur. Is the fact that they have a thicker fur. But natural selection cannot explain the origin of the fur. Just the fact that it survives. So it's kind of redundant. You're pretty much saying something that is adapted remains adapted and spread out. And actually, natural selection is eliminating variation, right? If you want to call it a cause. But it's not a cause, it's an effect. So evolution, if it wants to have any credibility, has to explain the origin of variation, not how variations remain in a population. And more importantly, he has to explain the origin of the deer, not only just, deers have big fur and they survive. And let's see if they do that. And the reason people call natural selection a cause is because Darwin himself opens the origin of species, his first book, with an error, a fundamental error, philosophical error, that is still present in academia today. I fell prey for this for many, many years. So the idea of Darwin was, he looked at pigeons, saw that they were very, very different. They saw that the breeders could select the breeds that he wanted, like characteristics that they were interested in. This animal has a bigger feathers, that one is taller, I want that. And they would select it and breed to get those variations, right? Fair enough. Darwin extrapolated that to nature. So he said, well, if a breeder can do that and make that different breeds in a short period of time, how much more can nature do if it has millions of years? Well, Darwin, it turns out that nature doesn't select because it doesn't have an intellect. But if you read Darwin, he's going to talk like he does. He maybe said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing in the whole world, every variation, or down here. So natural selection has sometimes modified, like a man does when he does engineering. So inadvertently, I'm not saying Darwin was a full pantheist, that he really thought that nature had a mind, but when he made that comparison, even if as an analogy, he ended up in a soft pantheism. And when you use this kind of thinking constantly, even if it's a metaphor, you're going to end up thinking like that, and your theory is going to end up being like that. And if you think it's not a problem, right in his days, people are already saying that natural selection was creating variations, that was selecting things, and Darwin felt forced in the 6th edition to say, hey guys, you kind of misunderstood here. I'm not saying natural selection creates anything, it actually eliminates things, but it's just a metaphor. Well, Darwin, if you keep talking like you were before, it's quite difficult not to get confused. And the confusion remains. This paper is from 2009. Meyer is one of the most important evolutionists of all time. And I could have put it like 100,000 examples here. Selection is not only a central force in nature. Force. A force. We just spoke about it. It's an effect. And it's also dynamic. Selection can vary in strength, direction, space, time. What's that even mean? When natural selection acts, blah, 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 and you're going to say that most evolutionists say that selection is creative. But, it's just a metaphor. Well, wait a minute. That's problematic. That's a philosophical flaw, a very deep one, and it's ingrained in the core of evolutionary theory. Because the whole book was about natural selection. So if you got that wrong, what did you get it right? So how do variations come about? Since it's the most important part of the story. Well, for Darwin, he didn't know. It was maybe a law, I have no idea, future generations figured it out. What is important now is that there are enough variation for natural selection to act, so it's okay. Today we would say there are mutations, and mutation can come in many different flavors. It can be point, small, or it can have even a gene that duplicates, or even a chromosome, but that's the source of variation. So what are mutations, you may ask? So very quickly, because these things are complex, but the main idea here, and that's a reductionist idea, it's not fully true, but for the new Darwinists, that's how it works. All of us have DNA within ourselves. According to the reductionists, it's the code of life, so it's going to tell all the instructions of your body. That's garbage, because life doesn't work like that. But this part is true. You have DNA, and you can think of us like as a book. It has letters, 4 letters. We call nucleotides, A, T, G, and C. They codify and know that in each step that I'm talking about, there is like a million things going on, right? It's very complex. So we have to simplify it here. So the DNA is read by enzymes into an RNA strand. This RNA strand is equivalent to the DNA in terms of the letters. It has one different letter, and that RNA It's going to be read by a ribosome and it's going to make a protein. Each 3 nucleotides makes a codon in a protein. Right? So the idea of mutation is that if you have a book and if you randomly make an error and change a word, then perhaps you're going to downstream change the protein. And maybe that change is going to be good. So effectively, mutations are error in DNA replication, which they expect will create a different RNA code that will be read in a different protein. So they're expecting that an error can create new variation and good variation. The problem is we know that mutations destroy genes, right? They usually make up very bad proteins that are either going to kill you if it's a very important gene, or it's going to be neutral. So mutation can be, as I said, in many flavors. I don't have to go through to this too much, but you can have an insertion of a nucleotide, so it's going to change how the RNA is going to be read, because now it's going to be, you're going to add one letter, but it reads in every 3, so you're going to shift the frame completely. You have mutations that are duplications, the whole chromosome gets duplicated, this kind of stuff, all right? So you don't have to go through much into it. And as I said, some mutations are silent because the protein is not going to change because the DNA code is redundant. So you can have the same 3 nucleotides coding for the same amino acid, which makes the protein, is a little box. So you can have a mutation that's going to change the nucleotide, but at the protein level, it's going to produce the same amino acid. So the protein is going to be the exact same. But you can create mutations that are going to create a stop codon, the protein is not going to be read completely, etc., etc., right? As I said, the vast majority of these mutations will lead to death or handicaps. But the evolutionist is hoping that eventually, because they're happening so often in the cell, eventually an error will lead to biological novelty. That's the whole gist of evolution, all right? And if you don't believe me, this Nobel Prize winner, Jacques Monod, which is an evolutionist, he will say that chance, because errors are, chancy, is at the core of evolutionary theory. Our novelty comes from errors in the DNA code. That's the theory that's been defended in universities, right? Now, you don't have to be a genius to see a few problems here. Well, chance presupposes purpose, because an error presupposes there is something right to be achieved. Mutations presuppose DNA, a cell that is able to read the DNA, the enzymes, the proteins, all that kind of information. Where did that come from? Because mutation could not be there if there were no DNA to begin with. So you already start with big problems. But the evolution will say, well, that's not our problem. It's the chemist's problem. Or your life, nothing to do with me. And as I said, the vast majority of mutations, they cause crazy stuff like this duplication of the whole middle part of the Drosophila fly. This thing is not a good thing. Besides, it looks very nice. Oh, a fly with 4, wings, and probably even more annoying. But no, it can barely fly. It's completely defective. And you know what mutations are. It's not X-Men. They're not usually good. Okay? And one thing that is important to say, and I'm going to do it very quickly, otherwise this talk's going to last forever. The idea of Darwin is not new. Okay? If you read Empedocles and Aristotle, you're going to realize that the atomists, pre-Socratics, were already talking about this. So Empedocles would say that the world was full of parts of animals and plants, and chance would mix them around. The combinations that were functional would stay alive. The ones who did not function would die out. So Aristotle will mention Empedocles that there was no men with heads of ox, and those would die, and eventually parts of men would mix, and then men would survive. So this idea of chance causing variation and then selection operating is very old. And but did that influence Darwin? Of course it did. And we're going to see that in a minute. But it's important to know that Aristotle and St. Thomas of Aquinas, that you probably know is the most important doctor of the church, and it's the most sound and safe philosophy that the church recommends. The word transubstantiation comes from Aristotelian philosophy with Thomism. he knew about Empedocles, and both of them said the idea that chance can lead to order and purpose and natures, like natures of animals and plants, is absurd. And now we're trying to make that into, a new philosophy of the church. Anyway, it's being refuted already. But anyway, so how did I get to Darwin? Well, Empedocles, Epicurus, and their followers were writing a lot. Lucretius wrote a huge poem about evolution and materialism, etc. This thing gets into the Renaissance in Europe. We know this from historical sources, and the Enlightenment boys get really excited about the atomist philosophy. And if you look at Newton, it's pretty much atomism. The whole Enlightenment was a metaphysical nightmare. It's not only evolution. But evolution gets there as well. So even before Darwin, people don't tell you this, but there were a lot of evolutionists in France, and particularly Edinburgh, the center of the French Revolution, right? And I'm not going to give you names because it doesn't matter. I'm just going to give you one name, which is Erasmus Darwin. Darwin's grandfather, he was already writing about how life would show up in a little pound of water in the beginning of time, and how life would get more and more complex. And it's important to tell you that this kind of idea has a pretty weird source, because Erasmus Darwin was a Freemason. Okay? And by the way, that little book where he talks about evolution got placed into the index of forbidden books by the Catholic Church. They don't tell you that, right? I'm not saying it was specific because of evolution, but because the whole thing is materialistic nonsense, right? So, of course, Darwin was influenced by his grandfather, and he did study in Edinburgh, which was a center of, revolutionary ideas. So he got exposed by Old Earth and all that stuff. I'm not going to get into Old Earth the younger, don't worry. I'm fine with whatever you want to choose here. It doesn't matter. So, okay. So let's quickly go through this apparent evidences for evolution. Because you could still argue, well, Aristotle was a pagan. We sanctified him through St. Thomas Aquinas. We can do the same with evolution, right? Although the two doctrines are exactly the opposite. One defends that there is purpose, design in nature and everything, and the other is chancy, leading to accumulation of things. So, mutation is a source of all variation. So we probably have a lot of good empirical data proving that mutation can do stuff, right? I'm going to let the evolutionists explain to you. This paper is a very interesting one. There is a crisis in evolution going on. They will not tell you this, but this paper was published in Nature, the most important journal on evolution, and they were discussing why evolution is a real thing, because they just realized that it just doesn't explain reality. And you had half of the people in the paper saying, yes, we need an urgent change, and you had people saying, no, everything's fine. Get away from us with this little talk of yours. And at one point, the guys on the right here, on my right, they summarize the empirical evidence for mutation and changes in genes to say that these guys who are claiming that mutation natural selection is not enough are completely wrong. And look at the examples that they give. To them is very, very strong evidence. The precise genetic determinant for countless adaptation has been documented in detail, ranging from antibiotic resistance in bacteria, camouflage coloration in deer mice, and lactose tolerance in humans. If that's the best you can do after 150 years, I have a problem. Because even those examples, even if they were amazing, they are not creating anything new. And that's the most important thing that you guys have to understand from this talk. Even by breaking genes through mutation, sometimes you can hit upon something that is adaptive, but is still destructive. Sounds contradictory, doesn't it? But for example, lactose intolerance. We all can digest lactoses, otherwise you wouldn't be drinking milk when you were a little baby. What that mutation does is that it just keeps the gene working after you are an adult. So there's nothing new going on there. You actually broke the gene. There is a good reason for you not to break lactase, because you're no longer a baby. But a gene can be broken and is now working 24/7, even as an adult, and it's doing what it used to be. So there's nothing novel being created here. You already had the gene to break lactose. It was just inactivated for a good reason, and the mutation broke what kept the gene turned off. It's like saying, well, the switch on my house got broken and it's constantly on right now, and my house is always with lights, therefore something novel was created. No, it's still being broken. So another quick example, falciform anemia has been associated positively with malaria. Malaria is a nasty disease happening in Africa and also in Brazil and other places, tropical regions. But the parasite that gets through the body through the mosquito needs to reproduce within blood cells. The guys who have falciform anemia, they have a very messed up blood cell. It turns out that the parasite cannot reproduce well within those cells because look at it, it's pretty bad. But nobody's going to tell someone who has falciform anemia, oh, you're an evolved human being, You have problems transporting blood through your oxygen through your blood, and you have all sort of problems, but, you happen to live in a malaria region, so instead of dying out of malaria, you die a bit later of anemia, falciform anemia. So do you see the point here? This map is showing that, where there's a lot of malaria, there's more frequency of falciform anemia. Because in those places, having falciform anemia is actually less worse than being affected by malaria. Because you're going to die out, and if you only have one copy of the falciform anemia gene, you can still survive. If you have both, you die, like very quickly. But nobody in their sane mind would say that that's evolution. But, if you want to call this adaptation, fair enough. One more example. There is an experiment in evolution running for the past more than 33 years. They've been raising Escherichia coli, which is a little bacteria, letting them evolve, changing the flask every X generations, and doing studies about the changes that they observed, the spontaneous mutations, and let them compete, etc. 30 years. That's like more than 73,000 generations of bacteria. And because bacteria have very, very short generation times, that would be the equivalent of 2 million years of evolution in man. So something really impressive must have happened in those flasks, right? It's quite a lot. And that's the most impressive evolution. And to be fair, I think this experiment is amazing. They're probably going to keep running, until bomb hits the place and we lose the flask. After 3,000 generations, and that's the most impressive change that ever happened. One population of this bacteria started eating citrate in conditions that were aerobic. That's it. And again, that's not a creation of novelty. E. coli can decompose citrate, but only when there is no oxygen around. Okay, so the capacity to do the breaking is already there. But because citrate is a terrible source of carbon, they only do it when there is no other option in very stressful environments. What the mutation did, it was actually 3 mutations, very complex. What they did, shuffle things around, and now the bacteria has this thing turned on even with oxygen present. So if there is that the citrate is the only source of food, then that bacteria will do better than normal bacteria because it can break citrate all the time. But again, did you create anything new? No. There was the citrate decomposing ability, digestion ability was already there. You actually broke a gene and made it being turned on constantly. And actually, when the conditions become good and the nutrients are there, glucose, whatever she prefers to eat, the mutated bacteria cannot compete against the normal bacteria because they're broken. That's the best that we ever came up with. That's the best experiment. And that's what they're telling you led to all the diversity of life from there, right? Another best example that I can give you, this population of flower, there is a mutant that instead of having petals that are very friendly to the pollinators, it kind of mutates and it makes a different type of petal, a sepal, that is not attractive to insects or anything. And for some reason, the mutated one is increasing in frequency in the population, even though it's damaged. Why? Because that's the explanation that they give. They're not very convinced about it. But in the paper, they would say, well, because they face less herbivory. For some reason, those plants get eaten less. Again, you lost a part of a flower, you broke the gene, and you're saying that that's evolution. Fair enough. And I'm not saying these things are not impressive. They are real, they cause things, but you cannot explain the origin of a flower with a mechanism that break what is already there. And the kind of thing that evolution has to explain is like, for example, the birds can actually see the Earth magnetic field. And some people are saying that actually they use quantum physics to do it. All right? So it's not just breaking genes and making eat citrates. You have to explain this kind of stuff. And you have to explain the bird to begin with as well. Solar-powered hornet founds that turn light into electricity. This is the kind of stuff you have to explain. I'm sorry. But Darwin, like modern evolutionists, he doesn't actually care. For example, that's a passage of the Origin of Species. How on earth come to be sensitive to light hardly concern us more than how life itself first originated. I mean, really? I would be quite interested in knowing how these things happen, right? But, for some reason, we don't care. So are you saying that species don't change and mutations only break and etc.? Well, it depends. It depends what you call species. If by species you mean biological species like evolutionists you say, just variations, like a finch with a larger beak than the other. No, these things happen all the time. And nobody ever denied it. It's a wrong interpretation of Aristotelian fixism that led to this criticism. However, metaphysical species, nature of things, the substantial form, cannot change. Because if you change, you'd cease to be what you are. It makes no sense, right? So what I'm saying is that genes just break and shuffle things. They cannot be the cause of the origin of novelty, of the origin of organisms. And we're going to see that the most impressive changes, because there are a lot of impressive changes in nature, they come through intrinsic mechanisms that are already there within the organism. And if you think that's just my opinion, this is a paper in Science, the second biggest journal there is. They ask the question, how many genetic changes it takes to create a new species? Well, the formation of a new species, blah, blah, blah. However, the number of genes changes involved in species is largely unknown. I mean, what do you actually know? I'm failing to understand here. This is one of the most important evolutionists of all time. And he's giving a talk, and he's saying that the modern synthesis, new Darwinism, the idea of random mutation, natural selection, etc., cannot explain these very tiny little things. Phenotypic complexity, bias in the generation of variation, phenotypic novelty, non-gradual forms of transition, non-genetic factors of change. Even evolutionists are realizing that their theory doesn't explain anything. And that's why they're pushing for a modern change synthesis, which is the one I showed before. And they get attacked for it. In that paper they say, oh, we're not intelligent design people, but we get attacked all the time just by challenging the dogma. So do we have changes then? And how do they happen if it's not mutation? Well, remember the classic example of the moth. It turns out it was not mutation. The classic example of moth is caused by a transposable element. Transposable element just means a piece of DNA that keeps moving itself from place to place in the genome. The evolutionists thought, because they think in terms of error, that most of our genes, most of our DNA code is just garbage. They even coined the term DNA junk. So they thought transposable elements were mutated genes that were jumping around and causing havoc. It turns out that they actually lead to adaptation. And we are starting to realize that they are part of the intrinsic causes of the organisms to generate adaptation. So this phenotype here is caused by an element, a transposable element, that inserts itself within a gene and changes the gene expression. In this case, making the moth a bit darker. That's not evolutionary change, because it's already within there, the organism. It's not changing over time. It's not changing allele frequencies. We know that few generations, you can have changes in skull shapes. For example, foxes, the wild fox and the domesticated fox, and the wild boar as well that we raise just by eating stuff. The mechanical forces when you're eating a different diet can change the skull shape. That's not evolution. Look at this paper. This is very telling. That's again Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, the most important journals that there is. Morphological novelty emerges from pre-existing phenotypic plasticity. Pre-existing. So, for example, those tadpoles over there, if you feed them different things, if you feed them a shrimp, they are usually omnivores. And when they are omnivores, their guts has a certain size, and they have a certain size, and their jaws have a certain shape. If you change your diet from detritus to shrimp, a more carnivore diet, their whole morphology change. They become larger, their jaws become stronger, they start predating on the dumb, small ones that don't eat shrimp, the vegans. And their gut changes size, because as you know, carnivores have smaller guts inside. This is not evolution. That potentiality to change and vary was already there and is influenced by the environment, not by mutation and natural selection. And that's quite impressive. So what these guys are claiming, and they're evolutionists, right? What they're claiming is that a lot of the evolutionary change happens when, for example, you have this tadpole that has these two phenotypes that express according to the diet. What would happen if part of those tadpoles lost their plasticity? Yes, then by a mutation that makes you lose plasticity. Couldn't you get a population of tadpoles and therefore frogs that get stuck in the carnivore phenotype and the other on the vegan phenotype? That's what they claim. So even after, and they're saying that if you lose the plasticity, even if you put the tadpole back to the original environment, or if you try to feed the shrimp-fed tadpole with detritus, it will not revert back to the other phenotype because it got stuck. And they're saying that that's a very good propeller of evolution. If that's evolution, I'm totally fine with it. Because what you have to explain is where did plasticity come from? Where the ability to produce two phenotypes would remain the same thing. Nobody would claim that they're two different organisms. That's, even in the same population, these two phenotypes can occur. Where does that come from? That's the thing. And you have millions of examples in nature. These two butterflies, they were classified as two different species. They are the same species. They change colors depending on the season. If it's wet, they become like this. If it's dry, they become like this. That's one organism. It cannot be evolution because evolution is changing genetic and allele over time in populations. That's one individual can express the two phenotypes. Arctic foxes, depending on the weather, they can express a more whitey fur or blacker fur. That organism, when they're predators in the environment, they grow larger just by the presence of predators. There are fishes, and that's going to be a dangerous thing I'm going to say. There is a fish that when there are females and male and you take away the males, the females become male. I'm not claiming that there is no sex in nature. Human beings don't work like that, all right? But that's a kind of change that can happen. It's already there. There's plenty. I'm not going to go through all of them before I get bored. But all of these are phenotypic changes. And you should know this. Look at cats and dogs. Nobody in their sane mind, not even an evolutionist, would say that different breeds of cats are different species. But look how much variation. And most of these things are not created by mutation. Some of them are. Like a pug definitely got mutated. I'm sorry for the pug lovers. That thing doesn't breed properly. I'm totally fine with being a mutation, yeah? But a lot of these things are just genetic diversity that is there, and it requires a certain type of environment or pressure to come about. And you can, in very few generations or a few thousands of years, you can get those cryptic variation to manifest, right? So this kind of change is fine. And I'm going to go further. I would say that every phyllite has a cat nature. For those who understand philosophy, St. Thomas of Aquinas, I think all cats have the same substantial form. They are essentially the same thing. Go watch a tiger in a zoo. They are exactly like a house cat. Even your daughter would say, "Look, Mom, there's a big cat over there." She recognized there is a catness to all these guys. So I'm giving to the evolutionists that maybe there was an original stock of a cat-looking creature, and all these guys came about not by evolutionary change, some perhaps variation because of mutation, but mostly because of inherent plasticity within the organism, as we saw just now. Where do I draw the line over the substantial form? That's a question that we cannot ask, but we can have a rough idea. But we can study and see what changes biology can do and what are the limits, and then we can roughly guess where the limit is. All right? Oh my, you guys are going to get bored because there's a few more. We're going to try to rush this. Homology is a big one. Well, look at that. Those guys are completely different. Those are mammals, by the way. You have like a human, whatever, a dog, horse, etc. You can read. Anyway, so they are completely different. They have different lifestyles, but according to, they have very similar bone patterns in the same location. The evolution is going to say, wow, I didn't have an explanation for this. They have a common ancestor which had that bone structure and pattern, and those guys inherited it. That's a very parsimonious explanation. It's fine. If you want to give that as a hypothesis of why some organisms share similarities, in this case here is the Hox genes which control most of the development of an embryo. They realize that very similar Hox genes that control where the head's going to go, where the thorax is going to go, are very similar to the Drosophila fly. They're very similar genes. So I understand, it's an interesting hypothesis, but you still have to explain how do you go from a human to a dog to a horse and a bat from a common ancestor. I don't care about your hypothesis. I want you to demonstrate that that can be done. The problem is that homology, and the idea here is that, well, if you look similar, it means that they probably have a very early common ancestor. They share a common ancestor which is common to them all rather than to something that is different. The big problem of evolution is that they make up ad hoc explanations, because when there are similarities that they know are not due to common descent through the ancestor, they invent what they call convergent evolution. So for example, this two lines of fishes that look extremely similar, they're cichlids that exist in two different lakes in Africa. We know from the evolutionists themselves, they know that these populations were separated. But for some reason, they evolved the exact or very similar morphology. This guy even has a little bit of a lip here. You can see, very cute. In both lakes, independently, this kind of forehead here, etc. So, if I was thinking in terms of homology as similarity, can you see the problem here? What would I do? I would classify these two as more similar, probably inheriting that phenotype from a common ancestor. This guy is the same, and I would put them in a tree such that these guys are more related to each other, these two are more related to each other, etc. But we know that they're not. These guys are more closely related to each other than they are to these guys. So what evolutionists make of it? Well, evolution must have created the exact same invention twice in two different lakes. That's what we call convergent evolution. In fact, I think, yes, maybe there was a cichlid stock in both, and they converged to these morphologies because of the causes that I've just described, the potentiality for change that is triggered by temperature, by diet, etc., etc. That's not evolution. The variation is already there. Oh, what about the similarity between humans and at the genetic level with mice, chimpanzees, 98%? Well, my friend, I
I don't know about you, I think I'm quite different from a chimpanzee. And if you think 98% of genetic similarity means something, I could grant you the evolution is 100% genetic similarity. That would only show that genetics is a terrible, terrible tool to describe humans and chimps. So why do we have the similarities? Well, we have 44% similarity with a fly. Are we 44% fly? What does that even mean? That's confound the identity with genes. And this is only on the coding region. Remember the junk DNA? They think 98% of the genetic code doesn't produce anything. It's just junk. And now we know it does produce things. A same gene can be cut in multiple pieces and rearranged and make different proteins. Causality is not only bottom up. Our genes. Every cell of yours has the same genetic material. And yet, you have heart cells, you have liver cells. If they have the same genetic materials, what makes them become blood cells or heart cells? It's not the genes. It's the cell. It's a lot of things going on. Because as we know in philosophy, the parts, including genes, they work for the sake of the whole. We are a substance. The parts only exist insofar I exist. So why does we have similarities with chimps and mice, etc.? I have a hypothesis, and I really think I'm right. And don't steal it from me, because it's going to be a Nobel Prize. I think it's because God, in His infinite mercy, made these animals be possible of experimentation. Imagine if life had a different code for every single animal. How could you test medicine on a rat? The reason you can inject mice with vaccines or whatever and try to apply that to human beings instead of getting human babies and doing tests to them is because some of the things that happen in the rat are similar to what happens in us. So the fact that things have similar genes, they have similar functions, doesn't mean that they inherit that from a common ancestor that evolved through natural causes. It just means that they use the same kind of stuff. It could be as well that God created. Why bother creating multiple genetic codes? Although there are more than one. The mitochondria, for example, is a different genetic code. So that idea is not true. And I'm almost finishing. Fossil record is the most famous one. Cambrian explosion. 20 phyla of animals show up abruptly in the fossil record. Okay? So you have this. Each one of these lines in an interval sometimes of just 5-10 million years. That's absolutely nothing. You have all the phyla. Phyla is the largest classification of animals and plants you can have. So arthropods, insects, chordates, all these big groups, they show up abruptly in a fossil record. No common ancestors. You go in the strata below them, nothing to find. That doesn't sound like gradualism to me, at least. And they're completely different. An insect's completely different from a chordate, right? Which is apparently the ancestor of all the mammals and etc. To the point that evolution got so embarrassed because they were expecting gradual change, mutation, making little, one thing at a time, but they came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium. Well, evolution is faster. When, on those times, evolution was way faster. So there was like a burst of adaptation and then stasis for millions and millions of years. I'm not joking. This was one of the most important, Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most important paleontologists, came up with punctuated equilibrium. Because he was seeing something that didn't match the Darwinian expectations. He saw species were exactly the same, perhaps small little changes over millions and millions of years, and points in time where just a bunch of new things show up with no, even a small sense of an ancestor. Where is the evolution then? And if you're not happy with Cambrian explosion because, oh man, it's just Cambrian explosion is the mainstream. Well, how about the Avalon explosion? The Untitled explosion? There's plenty. Marine reptiles, I have no idea where they come from. There's no ancestor. Bats, no idea. Pterosaurs show up exactly as they are. Mammals, all the orders, no ancestor. Plants, Darwin was aware of this. The rapid development, as we can judge, of all the high plants within recent geological times is an abominable mystery. He was talking about the angiosperms, the flowering plants. They show up in the fossil record out of nowhere, and already with a simultaneous relationship with pollinators, etc. So this thing just boom, they're there. Abominable mystery. And here it is being talked about in Nature this year. Why? Because they found an amber, Jurassic Park style, with a plant that is literally exactly identical to a modern genus of a flowering plant. Literally exactly the same. Even the adaptations to fire, they identified. That's embarrassing. That's like 100 million fossil, and it hasn't changed in 100 million years? That's crazy. Where is the evolution? Anyway, it's very big, but it's just a few paleontologists saying, I'm not making this up. They appear suddenly in the fossil record. Evolutionary novelty is usually dropped and shown with a bang. This is a paleontologist, evolutionists admitting. Where is the evolution? About humans, same thing. A big bang theory of human evolution. There are things that look like monkeys. There are things that look like humans, and nothing between. Even though they try really hard to study prompts, rethink of human evolution. This every 3 weeks I see something like that. New fossil changes human evolution. Why? Because they're desperate to find one. It's very powerful. Imagine if I find the half ape, half man, I'm going to become, I'm going to have grants for the rest of my life. So there's part of a chase, and they can't find it. How about those very, very clear, apparently clearly examples of transitional fossils? Like, they say, there's a fossil record showing a transition from a horse that had 3 feet to 1 feet. You have the whales, and you have the birds. The birds, Archaeopteryx, etc. Those are transitioners. That proves evolution. Well, fossils don't tell anything. How do I know that this guy came from this guy? I cannot. You use the idea of homology. Well, this guy has something that is similar to this, and we try to use some algorithms, and they blah, blah. There is a few problems, though. This thing is a fraud. Or not a fraud, but it's completely wrong. And that's admitted by the evolutionists themselves. Why? Because these are North American horses. If you look at the fossils of the South American horses, the order is the opposite. They go from 3 fingers to 1 finger to 3. So how does that work? So evolution goes, both ways. Sometimes horses go from 3 to 1, then sometimes 1 to 3. This thing has a problem. This guy's supposed to be the ancestor, right? He's actually younger than what he's supposed to have given birth to. This fossil is younger. So when you put things on a line like this, you sound, I can see. There's another problem. So this guy is the size of a freaking dog. That's a whale. All right? And trust me, it's not only stretching bones to make a whale out of a dog. The adaptations of the whale have in behavior, blood circulation, how many mutations do you need to make? And remember, mutations don't do anything, they just break. Where are you getting that from? That's the best I can come up with. Fossil. Well, I'm not convinced. Because, for example, this thing apparently happened within 7 million years. If that sounds a lot to you, the average, that's evolution is saying, that's not me. The average time a single species lives in geological time until it goes extinct is on average in between 2 to 10 million years. One species, from its inception to its death. So you're saying that the interval that one species usually lives, you had a dog-like creature leading to a whale, right? And this is a phylogenetic tree showing the relationships between birds. You see those 2 birds up there? They're very similar. I studied this bird in my master. They just vary in terms of a little bit of size and color. If you look at their common ancestor of those 2 groups, you cannot see here, but it's like 13 million years. So it took 13 million years to change a little bit of a color of 2 birds. They're saying that in 7 million years, you made a whale out of a dog. Look in the picture. And I have a very good example that I really love about transitional fossils. Meet the platypus, or in my view, God's way of laughing at transitional fossils. This guy, in my opinion, looks exactly like a cross between a duck and a beaver. Yeah, and it's not me. Look at this stuff. I mean, God's most amazing creation after human beings. Why I'm showing you this? Because if you're a paleontologist and you don't know anything about the fauna and you're just studying the fossils, and you find a fossil of this thing, and you know duck fossils and beaver fossils, wouldn't you probably put this guy as an ancestor of both? If you didn't know better? Of course you would. Because fossils don't talk. You can put them in whatever order you want. You have to show the causes. If you cannot show the cause of, that leads, as I said multiple times, from a dog-looking creature to a whale, I don't care about how you think some fossils look like each other. Even I'm tired right now. But yeah, so it's just some admonitions of Darwin, because he knew his theory was idiotic in many ways. So it's like, to suppose that the eye could have formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. Thank you, Darwin. I also think that you're right. Anyway, he's sometimes Darwin has some really, he's pretty honest about the power of his theory. So to finish this up, how about theistic evolution? Because you're like, oh, Romil, that's, you're describing all these things, mutation, blah, 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 but that's atheism, right? That's atheistic evolution. I believe there is a God. He just uses evolution to make things. Oh, it doesn't quite work, does it? Because otherwise, what exactly do you mean by saying that God uses evolution? First of all, there's no signs of gradualism at all in the fossil record in nature. You have things showing up abruptly. You have things that have already a potency, a latent potency to change. That was not evolutionary cause. Aquinas says creation is not change, so what exactly is going on there? Creation is ex nihilo, right? It's God bringing things from nothing in all their substance. It's contradictory to, I think everyone would agree, that it contradicts Catholic theology, Adam and Eve, Genesis 1 and 2, contradicts probably even the biological evidence. So what exactly is going on there? And there is a problem, it's a contradiction. Because you could claim, the problem is with theistic evolution, they come in many different flavors. But the most common is that while God uses secondary causalities through his providence, very improbable mutations can happen. But the problem here is a metaphysical problem. Mutations don't do what evolution requires them to do. They only break and shuffle. So even in God, he cannot make a contradiction. So if he's just using secondary causality, he cannot make a mutation do something above her nature. If he does, then it's no longer a mutation. It's a special act of God doing something. But even if God was tweaking, especially with evolution over time, you would still see gradual step of changes, perhaps some weird things going on over there. First of all, showing this scientific would be a mess. But second of all, we have no reasons to believe in that at all. Not from the Bible, surely, not from Catholic theology, philosophy, but not even from the fossil record and biology. So, to finish, should a Catholic be an evolutionist? Do you have any reason to be an evolutionist? I didn't even try to get on the part of the theological problems, right? Even my dog is upset with all of you evolutionists. So, and my answer is a resounding no. But it's up to you. You can interrogate God when you go, confess, and ask God, could I make the fossil record a bit more to my liking, perhaps? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed.